Okay. Good afternoon again. So this is, so as Yolanda was saying, this is a policy report, so a 6-month study, which is coming to the conclusion. It's probably going to be, well, it will be submitted in the second half of April. And it's led by myself and Audrey Dobbins from University of Stuttgart, with contributions from many of the other partners across the InsightE consortium. So I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of what we've been trying to do with this policy report. So some background to the study. There is strong evidence of energy poverty, which means that individuals are not able to adequately heat their homes at affordable cost. So for example, a project in 2009 quoted between 50 to 125 million households, and we've reviewed around 10 European studies that highlight that there is this entrenched problem. Of course, to say up front, one of the issues around all of this is what adequate means and what affordable means, and that comes to the heart of the problem of definition. And then, as Yolanda was saying, through the third energy package, the Commission requires member states to identify vulnerable consumers and energy markets in order to provide protection, but also enhance their participation as consumers. And of course, actions can include those addressing energy poverty as well. But what really emerges from what we've been doing is that while both of these concepts as vulnerable consumers and energy poverty are linked, they are quite distinctive issues as well. So maybe they require different definitions, and we see that across member states, very different types of measures are being taken to address both of these issues. So what are the study objectives? Well, really to focus on the policies and measures relating to vulnerable consumers and energy poverty across the EU28. Specifically, the issue of definition: how do different member states define energy poverty, if at all, and vulnerable consumers, which they have to according to the legislation? What are the different measures that have been put in place to address the issues? Based on our review, what are the similarities and differences across member states? And then, critically, which we know is important for the Commission, what can they do to develop action in this area? So those are the 4 key objectives of the study. Okay, so the first thing to talk about is definitions of vulnerable consumers. And the first thing we see, based on the framing of this issue in the legislation, is that there is a large variation in definitions used, reflecting that vulnerability to different member states means very different things. And what we've tried to do in this table is kind of characterize what the definitions focus on in regards to vulnerable consumers. So a number of countries really do focus on the issues of energy affordability. Others frame the definition around social welfare. For others, it's around health and disability. For others, it's quite a range of different socioeconomic groups that could be considered vulnerable. And then some countries are, of course, still thinking about how they actually address this issue of definition. But I mean, it's interesting that, people have very different perspectives, and essentially this issue means different things. And the question is, does this variability matter? Well, we say probably, because if the intention is to help address vulnerability of sorts and energy poverty, the definition matters, because the definition drives the action that follows. So that's one of the key things that we've been thinking about. I've got another presentation going on here as well. Okay. So that was vulnerable consumers particularly, but we also wanted to focus on energy poverty as a distinctive issue across member states. Now, in the context of this whole area, there are two broad approaches to these issues. One is very much a social policy focus, and one is an energy policy focus. And what we mean by policy focus is that member states view the problem through a specific lens and they implement measures accordingly. And some come at it very much from a social welfare perspective, others come at it from much more of an energy policy focus. And then, so what we've tried to do is kind of map, I mean this of course is fairly subjective, but there's some interesting patterns, if you like, where certain countries over in the West are very much focused on this issue as an energy policy problem, and similarly in some parts of southern Europe too. Whereas in the northern member states, it's very much addressed through social policy. And I think this kind of, even though it's somewhat subjective, it's an interesting way to start grouping member states together to kind of get some idea about what are the similar approaches being taken across member states. So just to focus, because I wanted to say something about energy poverty, to focus on the energy policy focused member states who often consider energy poverty explicitly and distinct from vulnerable consumers and therefore requiring different actions. And where those member states have these different strategies to address the two issues, so we see that they have distinct strategies, but they need to be synergistic because the two issues are very much related. And then, of course, the countries who are looking at energy poverty have this issue of definition. So what we've also done is reviewed the definitions used in different member states and sort of tried to tease out some of the lessons around definitions for energy poverty. That is to properly identify the consumers to target, orientate effective action, actually be able to operationalize these definitions based on the data available, and also to allow for measurable progress in terms of understanding whether the issues being tackled according to the measures being implemented. So so that was definitions. In terms of measures, we've looked across nearly all member states now and reviewed around 280 measures across 4 different categories, and these are all measures that are targeted either at vulnerable consumer issues or in terms of energy poverty. And we've classified them as in terms of financial interventions, consumer protection, energy efficiency, and information provision and awareness raising. And out of the 280 measures, around 40% are explicitly targeted on vulnerable consumers and energy poverty, because there's a lot of measures that aren't targeted but are still extremely relevant to the situation. So we're coming at this from a fairly broad perspective. And the reason for reviewing these measures is to start to try and tease out what are the effective measures and what is their transferability across member states. And that's kind of what we're working hard on at the moment, having done the review by member states. So that's really the difficult thing, is actually identifying effective measures and then thinking about their transferability across member states. Just to pick out a few things, in terms of financial interventions, which includes payments through social welfare systems, 40% of member states, social support is the primary measure in terms of identifying vulnerable consumers and providing additional support. In terms of other countries, energy efficiency, 30% of member states use energy efficiency type measures as the basis for addressing these specific issues. And of course, within these categories, there is huge diversity in the types of measures that are being used, and also how they're targeted and how they're funded and implemented and who implements them. So there's all kinds of criteria you can look across to see, you know, what different member states are doing in this area. Just to put up one example, so energy efficiency, we have the kind of 32% of the measures we reviewed were in this category, and you can see the split between the kind of measures that have been implemented, from appliance grants to particular measures targeted at social housing, energy efficiency, through grants and loans for building retrofit. Some are non-targeted, others are more targeted on low-income households, for example. So there's a wide range across all of the different categories. And as I say before, you know, what we're trying to do is pull out those interesting measures that member states are using and see how they could be transferred to kind of develop a database of effective measures and their transferability. Okay, so some conclusions. Sorry about the terrible slide, but let me try and work through it. One of the first obvious conclusions is that member states view the problem in very different ways. And that's clear from the definitions that are emerging. We also think that it's important to recognise that vulnerable consumers and energy poverty are distinct issues that require different action. At the moment, the guidance and the directive kind of sort of mixes them together, and we wonder if that's the most effective way of going forward on this. The other interesting thing is, while we're coming at this from a regulated markets perspective, vulnerability and energy poverty are also features of energy use in households that are not supplied by those markets. So rural off-grid houses, maybe urban district heating systems in certain countries. And that's obviously an issue that is relevant but maybe can't be addressed through measures that are implemented via directives to do with the regulated markets. The other thing is distinct definitions are used in some member states for energy poverty and vulnerable consumers. And of course, we've already mentioned that we think they should be synergistic, although distinct. And so the clear thing, of course, is that types of measures introduced depend on a huge range of factors. So it's what member states understand to be the problem, its level of recognition, the policy culture, extent of market liberalisation, that matters in terms of the types of measures you introduce, and of course the physical characteristics of the household energy system and the building stock. And then in terms of targeting these measures, there's a balance between existing systems, available data, and the issue being addressed. So the example of energy poverty, clearly, if we want to target measures, we need good data on things like household expenditure, income. But you know, there are clear limitations across member states in terms of the data that's available. So maybe it's more practical to work through a kind of social welfare system. These balances have to be made. Okay, last slide. This is very preliminary. We're working on this, so this isn't any means definitive. It'd be good to get your views on this. But we were thinking about potential areas for further EU-led action. So the first one is on the definition, to maybe think about the guidance on defining what is the issue that we are seeking to address. Then in terms of legislation, strengthen the Commission's role through the development of a dedicated strategy and maybe some reorientation of funding. There might be, and a number of research projects have suggested that there might be ways of tweaking the energy efficiency legislation to maybe orientate funding more towards tackling energy poverty. And then in terms of data monitoring and further research, provide overview of applicable and best practice measures, and that's at the minimum what we hope this report will provide. Also consider the reporting requirements under the relevant directives to better provide information to the Commission on the data that is available on vulnerable consumers and the types of measures targeting them. And then finally, a really important one, I think, is maybe to think about developing appraisal methods and guidance to better understand policy impacts, maybe through the impact assessment guidance at the Commission level, but also at member state. And for example, the UK is working a lot on how to better characterise distributional impacts from different policy measures. So these are very much preliminary and work in progress for sure. But great to get your feedback on that.